June 1942. Deep in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the course of history was altered. Naval forces, fighter aircraft, and battleship cruisers started what would become a historical war. The Imperial Japanese Navy, riding high on a string of victories, targeted the remote island of Midway. This battle, they believed, would solidify their supremacy and define the fate of the Pacific. This is the insane Battle of the Midway. Chapter 1. Yamamoto's Plan. 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor during the Second World War, the Japanese sensed their vulnerability in their struggle against the Americans. In the aftermath of the Pacific War's onset in December 1941, the Japanese military swiftly launched campaigns across US, British Commonwealth, and Dutch territories throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. By March 1942, they had completed their initial phase of capturing Malaysia, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and various islands on the Central and Western Pacific. The next phase, initiated by Japanese Imperial Headquarters on January 23rd, aimed to isolate and neutralize Australia and India. At this moment, they needed to expand their influence across the Pacific. This involved seizing bases in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands to pave the way for future operations against New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. By early March, Japanese forces had secured the entire north coast of Papua. During this period, American naval intelligence operated from 2 secure centers, one in Melbourne, Australia, and another at Pearl Harbor. A third center at Corregidor faced heavy Japanese attacks and was deteriorating rapidly. Their third target was the Midway Island, strategically positioned between the United States mainland and Japan. By 1942, Midway housed a new American naval and air force base, made for its greatest test. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, was the general in charge of the war. The Japanese Navy frets over America's formidable wartime industry. So, Yamamoto orchestrated the plan he was confident would lure the remnants of the United States Navy into a deadly trap. He believed a swift action on US naval forces was necessary before America's full military might could mobilize. However, Yamamoto planned a 3-pronged approach towards Midway. 4 of Japan's mightiest aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the vanguard of an armada that seemed unstoppable. This is where the first attack comes into play. An air attack on the island launched from 4 first-line Japanese aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Using Pearl Harbor's tactics, Yamamoto's strategy hinges on a surprise attack, a diversionary maneuver to the Aleutian Islands off Alaska's coast to draw American fleets away from Midway, setting the stage for Japan's big move. Secondly, an invasion force of ships and soldiers led by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo. And finally, once expected US reinforcements from Pearl Harbor arrived, a joint strike by Nagumo's forces and Yamamoto's own fleet, which would be waiting 600 miles to the west. Now, the objective was clear: to annihilate the American carriers and secure Midway as a strategic outpost, further expanding Japan's defensive perimeter. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi strides across the commanding bridge of the formidable Japanese aircraft carrier, the Hiryu. This time, he commands not just the Hiryu, but also the Soryu, alongside the Akagi and Kaga, all part of the elite Kido Butai task force. It's a big day for Yamaguchi and the Japanese Navy. As dawn broke on June 4th, the Japanese fleet launched wave after wave of bombers and fighters. The air was filled with the mechanical fury of engines, and the sky erupted in deadly fire. Just hours ago, 108 Japanese planes launched a daring strike on the US military base at Midway Atoll. Amidst the tense preparations, Yamaguchi receives urgent orders from Admiral Nagumo, signaling a shift in the course of the battle. In the letter, Nagumo said, During the Battle of Midway, Yamaguchi sparred with his superior officer, Admiral Chiuchi Nagumo upon the reconnaissance plane discovering an American aircraft carrier near Midway. At the time, the Japanese carrier's planes were armed with bombs. Nagumo wished to switch the armament to torpedoes. Yamaguchi demanded that no time be wasted and that the planes be launched to attack the American carrier with bombs. As American aircraft from Midway close in, Japanese Zeros scrambled to intercept, unleashing a fierce defense against the vulnerable American torpedo bombers. Though some managed to press their attacks, the Japanese were lucky as near misses spared the Hiryu and its elite task force from direct hits. Midway's airfields were in ruins, and victory seemed within the reach of the Japanese. Unknown to the naval forces, the war had just begun. Chapter 2: The Second Wave. Despite the chaos, preparations for a crucial second wave against Midway Islands intensified on board. Yet, with the time running short, the massive effort to rearm aircraft became insufficient, leaving the Kido Butai ill-prepared for the next phase of the battle. As the sun set, the reality of the defeat was inescapable. The Imperial Japanese Navy, for the first time, had tasted the bitter ashes of loss. Earlier on, Japan had postponed their planned capture of Port Moresby due to setbacks. An American carrier strike on Japanese shipping at Leh and Salamau, coupled with the unsuccessful attack on Rabaul, revealed to Admiral Shigeyoshi Inuya that Japanese air superiority in the region was not assured. It wasn't until early May, with Admiral Inuya having 3 carriers ready, that the invasion could proceed. The Coral Sea saw the first carrier battle of the war. Both sides suffered damage, with the USS Lexington lost for the Americans and the light carrier Shoho for the Japanese. More critically, the Japanese abandoned their invasion attempt, marking their first setback in the Pacific. At this time, American codebreakers had provided vital intelligence on enemy forces and operational plans to the Allied commanders in the South Pacific. Meanwhile, indicators from intercepted communications early in 1942 pointed to Japan's intent to expand east of the Marshall Islands. Air units and supplies were noted in messages to and from the Marshall and Mandates. The designation AF started appearing in decrypted messages. Japanese seaplanes, refueled from a submarine at French frigate Shoals in Hawaii, conducted a reconnaissance mission over Oahu. Finally, on March 13th, American cryptanalysts cracked the Japanese Navy's general-purpose code and identified AF as Midway Island. Shortly after midnight on June 4th, Admiral Nimitz, acting on reconnaissance reports from patrol planes, alerted Task Forces 16 and 17 about the Japanese fleet's position and trajectory. They were approximately 574 miles from Midway. At daybreak, a patrol plane sighted 2 Japanese carriers with their escorts, warning of an imminent attack. The initial engagement started with 4 night-flying PBYs targeting Japanese transports northwest of Midway. One PBY successfully torpedoed the fleet tanker Akabono Maru. Around 6:30 a.m., Aichi D-3A dive bombers and Nakajima B-52 torpedo bombers, supported by numerous Mitsubishi A-6M fighters, launched an assault on Midway Island defenses. Despite heavy losses among defending U.S. Marine Corps Brewster F-2A and Grumman F-4F fighters, which lost 17 out of 26 engaged, the Japanese inflicted minimal damage on Midway's installations. Additionally, motor torpedo boat PT-25 sustained damage from strafing in Midway Lagoon. Over the next 2 hours, Japanese Zeros on combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire from the fleet repelled repeated American attacks. These included Marine Corps Douglas SBD and Navy Voigt SB-2U scout bombers from VMSB-241, Navy Grumman TFB torpedo bombers from VT-8 detachment, and U.S. Army Air Force Martin B-26 bombers armed with torpedoes. Despite efforts, these attacks failed to damage the Japanese carriers. Even U.S. Air Force Flying Fortress joined the assault without success, though they suffered no losses themselves. Between 9:30 and 10:30 a.m., Douglas TBD torpedo bombers from VT-3, VT-6, and VT-8, launched from 3 American carriers, initiated an assault on the Japanese carriers. Despite heavy losses from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, their attack diverted enemy fighters, clearing the way for dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. VB-6 and VS-6 Dauntless bombers from Enterprise inflicted fatal damage on carriers Kaga and Akagi, while VB-3 Dauntless bombers from Yorktown wrecked the carrier Soryu. The American submarine Nautilus also attempted to target the burning Kaga with torpedoes, but they failed to explode. By 11 a.m., the surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched VAL dive bombers that temporarily disabled Yorktown around noon. Later in the afternoon, Hiryu's Kate torpedo planes dealt a second blow, forcing the abandonment of Yorktown. In retaliation, Dauntless bombers from Enterprise dealt a fatal blow to Hiryu around 5 p.m. that evening. The destruction of the Japanese carrier strike force compelled Admiral Yamamoto to abandon plans for invading Midway, prompting the Japanese fleet to retreat westward. During the battle, Japanese destroyers rescued 3 U.S. naval aviators from the water. Sadly, after interrogation, all 3 Americans were executed. Lieutenant George Gay, a TBD pilot, managed to evade detection by Japanese ships and was later rescued by a PBY aircraft. However, the war was far from over. Chapter 3: The Final Strike. On June 5th, Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Spruance, pursued the retreating Japanese fleet westward, while efforts continued to salvage the damaged Yorktown. Japanese destroyers scuttled both the Akagi and Hiryu, which had been heavily damaged the previous day. The final air assaults of the battle occurred on June 6th, when dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet attacked and sank the heavy cruiser Mikuma. They also inflicted damage on the destroyers Asashio and Arashio, as well as the cruiser Mogami. Following Admiral Spruance's orders, given after the loss of 3 torpedo squadrons on June 4th, the Devastator torpedo bombers from VT-6 did not engage due to the threat posed by surface anti-aircraft fire. Task Force 16 then turned eastwards and disengaged from the enemy. Intelligence intercepted over the next 2 days confirmed the Japanese withdrawal towards Saipan and the home islands. Meanwhile, on June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-16 disrupted U.S. salvage operations by torpedoing Yorktown and sinking the destroyer USS Hammond. American screening destroyers launched depth charges against I-168 but failed to destroy it. Yorktown, heavily damaged by multiple torpedo strikes, finally capsized and sank at dawn on June 7th. 2 days later, the submarine Trout rescued 2 survivors from the sunken Japanese heavy cruiser Mikamu. 10 days later, on the 19th, the seaplane tender USS Ballard, guided by a PYB, reached the location where crewmen from the Hiryu were adrift in the water. The tender saved 35 Japanese survivors, who had been abandoned deep within the carrier during its sinking. On June 21st, a PBY from VP-24 rescued 2 men from a TBD aircraft from Enterprise, located about 360 miles north of Midway. These individuals were the final survivors of the Battle of Midway to be recovered. While the performance of the American carrier air groups would later be scrutinized, their pilots and crew ultimately prevailed through bravery, resolve, and selfless sacrifice. The Japanese lost all 4 of their large carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, whereas the Americans lost only 1 carrier. Most significantly, over 100 highly skilled Japanese pilots were lost, irreplaceable assets to their war effort. Reflecting on this bitter defeat, Admiral Nagumo's chief of staff later lamented, "In a broader strategic context, Japan's Pacific offensive was severely disrupted, and their plans to expand into New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa were postponed. Shortly after the Battle of Midway, the US and its allies would seize the initiative in the Pacific. For Japan, Midway was a harsh awakening, marking the end of unchecked expansion and the beginning of a defensive struggle. The loss of 4 prized aircraft carriers and hundreds of skilled aviators left scars that would forever remain in the rich history of the Japanese.